reporting space with a couple of dimensions. One is what I would call a voluntary dimension, and we'll get into the detail of what that means, which I'm trying, when I say that, I'm trying to talk of efforts where a company is not necessarily forced to, by law, by regulation, to comply to some sort of a reporting. It's more voluntary in nature. I'm sure it's not an alien term to any of you, but we'll get to what that means. Now we look at in the voluntary space. In the voluntary space, what's happening in terms of consolidation? And then we'll get to the rest of the slide, which is of course going to pop up. But to begin with, even before I go to the next thing on my screen, I believe we may have heard at some point about something called integrated reports. Can somebody quickly jump in and tell me what one would have thought of or understood of integrated reports, what they mean?
It's a report where we include all ESG aspects along with the financial angle. It's just not the financial aspects, but more importance to ESG aspects.
Wonderful. That's a very nice way to put it. I agree. Now, why is that important? I'm sorry, I can't really see who's answering it, but I'm just keep going on with the conversation. Why is it important to have all of it in one place? Is there a real rationale for it?
Yes, of course there is, because till now it was only the financial angle which was put forward in all the reporting.
Hmm.
So now ESG has come up because now, because of the climate change, environment awareness have increased, and along with that the other aspects also. So especially in abroad, especially for long term investment, people are looking for those kind of sustainable investing or responsible investing. So this ESG report would help in that, and especially even
The
to
ESG
attract.
report would help. Of course, I agree. I'm again asking you, why is it important to integrate? Why couldn't it still be two reports?
It's a I feel it's like it will be difficult. One is easy for comparison, and it just based on one aspect alone we cannot attract the I mean investment. So it's like finance plus this is something which will attract more investment
But
when they come up
finance
in the.
plus, so if you have two reports, it can still act as A plus B, right? Why do you need to combine A and B and make a C out of it?
In order to
Is it
project company's overall growth and
Right,
contributions.
right. Okay, fine.
company's overall impact to be very specific in front of the investors and the clients?
Right, right. So
It's a way
let
of
me, yeah, sorry, go on, complete your line.
it's a way of integrating both rather than just one, because one will have an impact on the other. So I think
Fair
they
enough.
wanted to bring that aspect.
I think that's the part, the interlinkage, right? That's important. So, if you guys have heard of aspects like integrated principles, somebody in the last couple of calls, I can't recall when that conversation happened, but we did mention about something around IR framework, integrated reporting framework. IIRC is the organization which came up with that framework. I'm hoping people are writing things down while I'm talking so that it helps you go back to Google and search for these things. But IR framework, integrated principles, is at the crux of it all. The fact is, what you talk about typically in an annual report is financial numbers, is a lot of management commentary on what the strategy has been till this point, this year particularly, plus what will it be in the years going ahead. The commentary, which is more literature, which is more verbose, which is more subjective, has to have a sort of a connect with what you're putting in your tables, which is probably the second half of your report, the annual report, I mean, which is where the numbers are coming up, the balance statements are coming up, the profit loss statements are coming up. So you cannot have a picture that is different in your commentary, which is the early part of your annual report, and then the financial numbers, which is the later part of your annual report. Plus the fact that there's a growing requirement, and I remember being asked this question in the first session where someone said, how do you even measure all of these aspects of ESG? So I think the question is more about S, but importantly, how do we measure? So why do we ask about it? Because everything's got to be objective to the extent it can possibly be. And in that regard, the idea is to see how we can bring that objectivity of the ESG into the integrated report, and the financial numbers plus this sing the same song. So it's the connectivity, it's the consistency, it's the preciseness of all this information that's important, and bringing it out in a very organic manner is super important. Now that's how I would have, of course, given a definition to this whole subject, but achieving it is another deal. right? And where do you think achieving it is the best way to go? What's the most mature part of reporting today? Is it the financial reporting or the non-financial reporting? Which one do you think is more mature?
Method is
Financial reporting.
Right? Financial reporting has been around for a good long time, easily a couple of decades or even more maybe, but financial reporting of course is. So just on the financial reporting aspects, every country again has a sort of a regulation or rather guidelines based on which reports happen. There's clear definition of what has to be reported and how it has to be reported. Now, if you were to look at things globally, the European region goes with something that's called the IFRS guidelines, and these are coming out from something called IFRS Foundation. This is European region, EU I'm referring to, right? I think it's International Financial Regulatory, blah, 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 but you could look up on the full form. I'm not really going to blurt out because I'm sure that there's a way that I'll miss things out there. But the important part is that IFRS Foundation is at the heart of setting out those guidelines for EU. I'll get to the point of why we starting with EU, but important is that now in the IFRS, it's something called the IASB, which is International Accountability Standards Board, right? So the IASB is the body that's been around for ages, and they have come out with what is called the Financial Regulation Standards, reporting standards, IFRS, right? The financial reporting standards have become the de facto standard for EU and the countries under the EU zone, of course. The US goes with something else. They go with something called GAAP, GAAP, and then they do their own. They have their own approach to financial reporting. Not to forget the fact that at the end of the day, the underlying subject is the same. Underlying aspects of reporting remain the same. It's just the few guidelines that will be very contextual to that geography. Getting back to where we are, I'm saying IFRS Foundation has for ages now had something called IASB, has also for ages now been having the companies in the EU zone comply with IFRS. IFRS by itself has been a reference point for a lot of other countries, including the Asian countries and India, where we have considered the IFRS as a reference point to evolve what is relevant for the guidelines in India. Now, why are we talking about this so much? Because this actually is now driving the consolidation effort. The fact that we spoke a few minutes back about integrated reporting, this is all financial, of course, right? Now, IFRS Foundation has come up with a body called ISSB, which is International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, this body is just about a year and a half or 2 years old, right? It's a very, very early in nascent stage. Now, why did they form the ISSB? Because they wanted to come up with something called ISDS, which is IFRS Sustainability Development Standards, right? So they wanted to evolve this, and they're still in the process of doing it. They're not there yet. Now, if you look at the fact that on the top half, you have something that's far more mature, bottom half, they are evolving this. There's very obviously going to come a point when these two bodies will have a lot of touch points. And why will that help? How will that help? Because we're talking of integrated reporting being the way forward. If this organization, this body and this body can keep that touch points going, it will ensure that whatever comes out as ISDS is something that is easy to relate to IFRS. Now, this is one part of the story. With this kind of an initiative that happened, a lot of existing standards and frameworks in the sustainability space globally also realized the significance. And in that context, what happened immediately was that parallelly, as this ISSB and all of this was being conceived and thought about, was that SASB and IIRC, we just briefly mentioned IIRC, which is the integrated reporting framework, the ownership of that framework lies with IIRC. These two folks, these two bodies, these two non-for-profit organizations came together in about November 2020 to form what is called the VRF, Value Reporting Foundation. Now, we are going to join these two pictures, but let's take a pause. This consolidation was the very first step to move things to a lot more, let us say, singular approach or a global approach on sustainability reporting. And then came something that happened with CDSB, which is, okay, again, I'm not going for the full form. I think Corporate Disclosure Sustainability Board, but I'm not sure I recall it well. But CDSB, which is again a very well-known organization in the space, plus VRF came together, and then they said we will join the IASSB, and we will dissolve ourselves, which means these teams are now part of ISSB. That happened not too long back. You see this 8 months back, 9 months back, right? So they have all gone into ISSB. Now that's the biggest sort of consolidation that has happened till this point. And
Sorry,
having said that,
which two teams you said again? The VRS and CASTB both.
These both are dissolved. They both are now part of ISSB.
Understood. Okay.
Right. Now, the point is that you got to start putting your focus a lot more on this space. Follow these guys. You can find IFRS on the internet. They have a wonderful website. They have a newsletter. They have a lot of communication they do regularly. Keep a track of those things if you were to be really interested in the consolidation efforts that are happening globally, right? But that's the latest piece of action. Now, then, having said that, then there is something that I'm going to call the standalone under the voluntary bucket. Standalone. This was all what's happening consolidation. In the standalone piece, we still have those names that we've heard of in the last couple of sessions: GRI, TCFD, CDP, right? Those names we've heard enough, but are they standalone? Will they remain standalone for long? We don't know, but at this point, they still are. If somebody told me a couple of years back that this kind of a consolidation is on the cards, I probably wouldn't have had too many hints to get there. But now I know that these things have happened. So there is a growing interest in consolidating it. And why do I say growing? Because what has happened with GRI and TCFD and CDP, I'll tell you. With GRI, they have signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with ISSB in March 2022 to kind of align the evolution of ISDS, which is the focus of ISSB. When they evolve ISDS, they are saying we will play a contributory role. They want it to align with the GRI, which, like we've said multiple times over the last couple of sessions, is of course the most widely adopted sustainability reporting standard. Now, that's what's happened in March 2022. TCFD is a reference. The inputs from TCFD have been used strongly by the ISSB to evolve what they're calling ISDS. So a lot of what TCFD has done, including members from TCFD, are part of that committee. They're not yet, the organizations still remain as they are, unlike the case with these at the bottom. These remain standalone, but they are already connecting themselves with this. So your guess is as good as mine in terms of where things could head from here. CDP, on the other hand, is connected not directly to ISSB at this point, but if you guys are already aware, CDP is one of the entities that formed CDSB in the first place. CDSB has its origins in CDP. So if they've kind of got them there, there's a good chance that there will also be some sort of a linkage that CDP will draw with ISSB. Right? I'm going to take a pause here because that's a very busy picture, a lot of alphabets. I told you there's going to be pain coming your way, but I'm happy to take a pause and just listen to what you have to say if you have any queries.
In the future, this ISSB and IFRS is for global. There'll be more region specific as well, right? Like for example,
I'll get there, which is exactly where I was going to get, right? Okay. So this is all what's happening globally, and even when I say globally, this is more. If you notice, IFRS Foundation has its headquarters in the UK. In fact, they've set up a Canada office as well, which means that they are also looking at the US region. But typically, their origins are in the European and the UK region now. But we are all equally aware, I'm sure, that Europe leads today in terms of sustainability reporting and approaches on that front. So in that context, yes, it's a good thing that it's happening there, and it will probably roll out for the rest of the countries on a voluntary basis. But when you talk about country specific, that's when the regulatory aspects come in. Now, there's not so much of a consolidation I would call in the regulatory space, but there's a bunch of things that are happening out there. US has released something that they call climate-related disclosures, and this was released by the SEC, the Securities and Exchanges Commission out there. The idea with that is that they want public consultation to happen, so they've released what is called a draft version about 5 months back approximately, and the consultations are still on till about November, I think thereabouts, and then they will announce it as a formal regulation for the US geography. So that's happening in the US. In the EU, there's another entity called the EFRAG. EFRAG has come out with European Sustainability Reporting Standards. And this one again is rolled out and I think applicable from the coming year onwards. So that's happening in Europe. UK has, I think the FCA is the regulatory body there for the financial, I can't recall what it stands for, but it's most often than not, it's the stock market regulator or financial markets regulator, right? They have released something called the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements, SDR, right? Now that is happened also this year. By the way, this was this year. This is still not out there in terms of a regulation, but this is also this year. UK FCA and the SDR story is as recent as this year. SEBI and BRSR, we all know, is as recent as this year. Singapore has something from their own stock market regulatory body as SGX, and they've got sustainability reporting principles. This is going to be rolled out, I think, coming year onwards. So if you notice what's happened in the last 8-12 months in this year and what will happen, of course, in terms of implementation in the coming year, there's a lot of action happening. Now, how will this side of things deal with this side of things as the evolution happens is dynamic. It's of course, we can't really second guess that at this point, but we got to be aware that there's regulatory action parallelly happening as much as voluntary action is also maturing itself in terms of standardization.
This is Reed. Can I ask, where does SFDR fit in?
So I think SFDR again is a regulation, is a recommendation in terms of what is required. If depending on the SDRs, depending on the SFDRs, the SDR reports would be created. So the disclosures are coming from here, but the SFDR sets the framework for the disclosure. So it's an important compliance parameter that will be also asked for when you do the SDR.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Any more questions, guys?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask that when we're looking at a global level of, like
Yep.
you're saying, consolidation efforts, so we can say that on a global level, ISDS might be the standard that.
Yes. So
global level
they
will be
have
going
already released a couple of versions, or a couple of let me call it module versions, not the entire booklet, but that they are definitely having plans to kind of iron this out in the next, I think, 3 to 4 years time. It'll take time. It'll take time because this whole linkage between the financial side and the non-financial side is no child's play. There's a lot of conversations and discussions, debates that will happen, of course, as part of that.
I just wanted your opinion on this. Do you think that the ESG reporting and sustainability reporting sector is mature enough for a global standard to come up, or do you think we need to debate a little more on this in terms of what it looks like?
So I'll tell you what I think will happen. This regulatory, which is occupying, let's say, 1/3 of the space here, will hopefully start expanding itself and become a more of a 2/3 or a 3/4 requirement, in the sense, in terms of magnitude. I hope you're getting me right. What I'm trying to say is that today the fact that these exist, or they have been in existence for a while now, is because there was nothing happening on this front so strongly. The moment this picks up attention and traction, there will of course be a lot of leverage that will come from this side, from the voluntary side, from the ISDS side, to kind of guide these folks. But at the end of the day, a regulation is what will drive more companies than any sort of voluntary disclosure, right? Voluntary disclosures have been around for 8-10 years. In fact, GRI, we know, has been there for a little longer, but the adoption is only happening eventually when somebody is arm twisting you, which is what is typically the case with the regulatory. You tend to respond faster, and that's what I'm hoping will happen. So there's a lot of focused attention that will come here. That's my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So who makes these standards? The voluntary.
Which ones? If you're referring to these,
the GFD, no, not the regulatory one, the voluntary ones.
Yeah, so these are all they call themselves non-profit organizations. So they are think tanks and bodies of coming together of different bodies that have created these entities, and then they evolve the standard. So when you look at things way back, there was absolutely nothing. GRI kind of started this whole conversation. I'm sure it wasn't an easy one to begin with, and so from there on, a lot of offshoots happened in terms of what gaps does GRI have. Like the SASB was born because there was the industry specificity that was missing in GRI, right? So all of these are addressing a specific need. TCFD is about, the name says, climate-related financial disclosure. You're trying to connect the climate-related aspects and trying to give them impact and effort assessment compared to the financials. So they solve a point in they solve a specific aspect of what is required that hasn't yet been fulfilled by existing ones. It's a coming together of bodies. I think at some point GRI had a lot of UN driving it in terms of UN pushing for it. Not saying UN participated and was an active member there, but I'm just saying they pushed for it because there was a need there.
What I meant actually was, the organizations, do they consist of individuals who have expertise in, let's say, environment, or is this done by auditors?
No, definitely. It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. Definitely a lot of gray-haired people with a lot of expertise on the subject are there. I mean, how else could they have evolved a standard? Or rather, even if it was not called a standard, the fact that they were able to kind of foresee what would be relevant for the industry, the entire private sector, requires a lot of diverse expertise and opinions to come together. So the answer is a strong yes.
And Arun here. Can I ask you a question?
Please do.
Great. So here's the thing. This is just out of the box. I'm just asking. When you say regulatory bodies here, I'm sure that everybody is focusing on the financial aspect of it, even now. At the moment, if you say, there are two questions to it. One, are you expecting a regulatory new body to be formed specifically for non-financial reporting or something of that sort, focusing? Otherwise, I see SEBI or FCA or securities, SEC in the US, everybody is majorly focused on the finance aspect of it, right? There's the non-financial is just an add-on, right? So are we expecting a new body to be formed which primarily focusing on this one? Or how these current bodies are really non-biased towards giving much importance to the non-financial aspect of it when it comes to the regulatory aspect of it?
So on the face of it, Arun, I'm sure you are right in terms of the face of it. Clearly looks like these are bodies that deal with numbers. Clearly, it's obvious. But then, having said that, I'll tell you, even if you just look at what's happened with BRSR and the template that's come out, I think it gives me immense confidence compared to a year and a half back, about how SEBI is serious about getting that non-financial disclosures sorted. Of course, it's still under the governance of SEBI. What is being told is that this will eventually be mapped to MCA, which is Ministry of Corporate Affairs in India, and it will become an online disclosure system on the MCA website. Of course, I know there are people who are not from India, so I'm just giving you a sense of what I mean when I say MCA. The point being that, yes, there could at some point be, in fact, there should rather be a reason for us to consider a regulatory body just for this requirement. But I don't think it's in unsafe hands, let's say, even if it is today sitting with these guys, because they do have a lot of reach and regulatory authority to kind of put rules for the companies, the private sector, so to say. So even where we are today, I don't think we need to have any second opinions about how strong is it in their hands, how safe is it in their hands.
True. Thank you. Just a question.
True. Okay. All right. I think what we wanted to just start with is this piece. And like I said, this was never part of the course coverage for this particular session, but I thought it'll be interesting for you guys to be hearing this out, and then we move on to what we actually intend to, and that's what we'll do before we lose out too much time. So I'm jumping in slides now. I have a picture on my screen, and I'm sure this is not an unfamiliar picture to a lot of people. I'm sure there's enough people who've seen this picture, because this is pretty much, if you go Google up on carbon emissions, this is probably the first image that pops up on Google. So for the folks who are familiar, great. We will probably talk about this in a little detail, but for the folks who are not, I think it's important we spend a little time. But before we get to spend time on this one, what I think we'll do quickly is if we can probably see how familiar are we with these terms with the group that we are, whoever is familiar, of course. I have a couple of questions on this screen, and if we can get the first 1 or 2 answers on this, and then we'll move on, just for me to get a sense of the understanding. I am putting my cursor on these 2 icons here, and of course we're talking scope 3, and mind you, the question is for the folks who understand the subject already, so there's no pressure on anyone here, but just to get the sense, I have something called processing of sold products, and I have something called use of sold products. Can somebody help me understand how are they different in the scope 3 indirect emissions category?
Processing of sold products primarily refer to the processes and the management of the quality aspect done by the downstream vendors. Like automobile company has different OEMs in place. So the emissions by those OEMs and the carbon footprint, particularly by those footprint, come under scope 3.
Oh, your OEMs typically would come upstream, right? You're procuring from your OEMs. What are you referring to here?
The takebacks of the I would say quality failed or the waste sold products.
Okay.
Takebacks.
Sure. I'm sorry to cut you there, but we'll get to that detail later. But I understand where you're coming from. Any other answer to that question? One last time.
Is it about post-consumption of sold products?
Which
like,
one? Which one is post-consumption?
I think use of sold products.
Okay, and what do you think this is?
Like how reusable they are?
What do you think this is?
This would be on recycling.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. So I get a sense. I'll get to the aspects, specific aspects in a while, but I'm happy I heard a few answers. One more quick question. We have something called leased assets here, upstream. We have something called leased assets here, downstream. What are leased assets doing on either side? Any idea?
I guess the leased assets on upstream is basically the factories or any kind of infrastructure which is there in order to manufacture the product. And when it comes downstream, we understand the retail shops or be it customer service centers or whatever, they come as leased assets in downstream.
Okay, I heard you. Thank you. One more answer, if at all. Pratiksha, while we waiting, is there a way to kind of get a show of hands about how many people understand this picture or rather have seen this picture earlier? Some sort of a hand raise and we can figure that out. Is that possible?
Yeah, there is a reaction.
Can we try that quickly? I want to quickly understand how many of you have seen this picture and you believe you're pretty familiar, if not completely familiar. Can we quickly get a raise of hands?
Yeah, please raise hand.
This asset may be vehicle.
Sorry?
Vehicles which has been taken for transportation.
Sure, no, we'll get to answering that. What I'm asking currently is if you have seen this picture and you believe you have been familiar with this picture for a while now, please raise your hand on the Zoom interface somewhere.
Yeah,
there's the raise hand feature, right?
Yeah, Arun here again. Just a quick step back here. I know that you're waiting for the answers, but just a word of caution that I am not familiar with these emissions, and I'm
absolutely. Which is exactly what I want to know. I mean so we'll go through this point by point, Arun.
Yeah. Just to give a little a sum up, like if you can just say a one-liner on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3.
I will.
Perfect.
That's the purpose. That's the purpose.
Okay, Anviti, sir, only 10 participants, 10. Yeah, I think 30% of participants know this, and
fair enough.
Otherwise, all of them are new to this.
That helps. Thanks for that. So great. So let's get into the details. So we will first start from things on the top. we've all heard of GHG emissions, greenhouse gases and the emissions. And these are the greenhouse gases, simple and straight. So 7 of them, we have carbon dioxide, we have methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, polyfluorocarbons. I can't recall what that means. But I think sulfur something, but there's NF3.
Fluoride.
Wonderful. And NF3 would be what? Nitrogen something. Wonderful. Okay, great. So you guys know what these are, right? Important part is there are 7 GHGs out there. That's what is kind of the whole the crux of the debate is around how do we cut down on these emissions. Now, if that is what is in focus, what is causing the emissions is what we will look at the bottom part. And while we look at the bottom part, you have to also be aware that there's this chain that we are talking about. There's upstream activities, there's what's happening in the reporting company, which is essentially the core company that you're focusing on, and then there's downstream activities. I think these are familiar terms, I'm hoping. What's happening before your core operations, what's happening in your core operations, and what's happening after you're done with your core operations in terms of downstream. So that's the chain. If you look at the upstream, before that, if you look at the reporting company, which is the core company, we talk of something that is called scope 1 emissions, which means to say what is causing emissions in your own home. When I say home, I mean to say in your campus, in your manufacturing setup, in your office setup, with whatever is kind of the boundary of your organization, right? What's happening? What are the in-house emissions, so to say? So you look at company facilities, you look at company vehicles and things of that nature, and anything else that is happening in terms of direct emissions that you are responsible for. So that's scope 1 for you, right? Scope 1 is your direct emissions, simple and straight. Only you can reduce them. If you had the will to do it, you will look at scope 1 first, reduce it before you even reach out to address anything else outside, left or right. So that's the in-house emissions. Then there's the indirect. In the indirect, there's something that you can have a clear visibility to, a much stronger understanding of when you talk of scope 2. Scope 2 indirect is something that is dealing with electricity. In the context of most operations, we're talking electricity. There could be some industries where you're talking of steam heating and cooling also, which is being taken from outside. So you may require steam heating and cooling for some sort of operations for which there's district cooling centers that are set up typically as an infrastructure item out there in the physical environment, and then they supply steam and heating, steam and cooling set as a service. Now, most importantly, apart from steam, I think.
Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, if a facility has a steam boiler inside the company facility,
that'll come
under scope 1 or scope 2?
That'll come scope 1. That'll come scope 1, right? But this is what that's why it's called indirect, right? When you have it right inside, it's still direct. But indirect is when you're purchasing it. It's the keyword is purchasing. You purchased electricity, purchased steam, purchased cooling is what we are referring to. And that is what you still are going to be responsible for, although the emissions are not being caused by you in your own campus. Of course, it's being produced elsewhere and then you're consuming it, but you got to account for it. And that accounting happens under scope 2. So scope 1, in-house, scope 2, purchased energy requirements, including electricity. Then comes the scope 3, which is by far the most challenging one, but also the most significant part of the pie. So if you look at a typical industry, and I don't think we can generalize every industry, but typically 70% of the emissions come from scope 3. So you can clearly sense why it's so important. And in there come a bunch of things. We're talking upstream first. We're talking of what is your input material that you're procuring. So if you are talking of an industry that depends a lot on raw material coming from outside, then that raw material is your purchased good. Or for that matter, any sort of service that you're taking from outside, contractual labor, let's say, that's one of the service you're taking from a third party. So that still is your scope 3 purchased goods and services. At the same time, raw material is something that you typically would procure on a regular basis. You use it. It's a entity that probably has a life of its own in terms of use. It gets used because you're continuously producing something here. Then there are something called capital goods, large capex kind of investment, whether it's land, machinery, things of that nature, which are bought once, but then there's of course an emission footprint associated with that one-time purchase. So those capital goods that you buy and you bring into the operations from outside, of course, is another part of your emission footprint. You got to track that. Then there's fuel and energy related activities. So one is about the material in what we talked of. Again, some more material in the capital goods. Then there is the aspect of the fuel and energy related activities. So you may have a lot of requirements for your operations that demand that you use you have a lot of fuel and energy use to get this across to you. So that's the other thing. So how do you address the fuel and energy related activities? Now, mind you, this is not the same as what we talked about here. That's a different one. So this is about some of those activities that are happening in your supply chain, and they are fuel and energy related, right? This is your supply side of the thing, of the equation, where a lot of fuel and energy is being used. Then there's the transportation. So all your raw material has to reach your location, your site. So the transportation and distribution associated with it, whether it is reaching from your supplier directly to your operations facility, whether it's passing through a lot of warehouses and reaching you, all of those are possibilities. But the whole idea of T&D, transportation and distribution, is about capturing that footprint. And in the process of doing all of that, there's a good potential opportunity, good potential reason to be conscious of the waste generated in those operations across everything in the supply chain on this side. So there's waste generated. And alongside all of this, there could be for different reasons in different companies. If it's a tech company, there's of course a lot of business travel we talk about. If it's a typical manufacturing setup, or for that matter, a services setup, maybe your sales folks and your leadership team involves themselves in a lot of travel. So the carbon footprint because of travel per se. Now you notice clearly that this one is not having a direct connect with the rest of the categories. Quite unlike all the other things, the business travel is a very distinct item. But the reason it's still important is because of the picture that it has right here, which is an aeroplane. Air travel, heavy footprint, clearly. And that's why it's still important. So you got to account for business travel, which is again different from employee commuting. Employee commuting is your daily home to office, office to home wala commute. It's a simple travel from A to B and B back to A on a regular basis. That's your employee commute, right? So there's business travel, which is travel that is probably going for client visits and all of that. And then there's the regular commute. And then now we have leased assets. This is upstream we talked of. Now here's where we're talking of assets that you don't necessarily own. So you are leasing assets from outside, but you got to still account for the footprint around it. You cannot not say, I am using a warehouse facility, but that's not my own. So why should I consider? No, that's not how it works. So you got to consider all of your leased assets as well, right? Whatever is helping you achieve your core operations, and it's a leased asset, you still have to consider the footprint. Of course, you'll go with calculating it appropriately because it's leased. Maybe it's co-leased. It's a facility that houses just more than what your company requires. So you will account for that separately. Now, I'm going to take a pause here because I think we've discussed upstream, and this is very crucial. If you have queries and questions on this one.
I have two queries.
Can you please explain the difference between upstream and downstream ones?
I'll get there. Okay. There was one more question I think somebody was trying to ask.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is waste generation in upstream activities. If you can elaborate it with some example, and leased assets in upstream.
In fact, you know what? We will do an example-based case study, or rather an activity. We'll get to that. But I don't think I need to give you examples. You will evolve this by yourself. I'll tell you how. I'll request you to just hold your thought for a minute, a few minutes. Yeah. For that other question that came up on upstream and downstream, you'll have to understand this like your supply chain. I'm hoping the concept of a supply chain in the industry is something we are familiar with. If you have to run an operation in your company, you have to manufacture something in your company, you can only do if you get the supplies from outside. Somebody has to still supply things to you. right? So the upstream is dealing with the supply side of the whole chain, and the downstream, after you manufacture what you have to manufacture, after your services are ready, you want to deliver the services or even distribute the products that you've manufactured, it needs to go to the market. It needs to reach your end consumer. So the downstream is what's happening from the gate, from your operations facilities gate to the time it's reached the consumer, and probably even beyond in terms of it reaching the grave. I hope we've heard of this concept called cradle to grave. Cradle to grave is a simple thing from the time of its origin, which is where the raw materials are, to the point of its end of life. What's happening? And so upstream deals with cradle to gate. Report this core operations is all that's happening inside your company, and downstream deals with gate to grave. Did I confuse you? Did I help you?
Okay, sir, got it. Thank you, sir.
Can you repeat it?
Makes it simple.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So if that's the upstream side of things, let's quickly look at the downstream, right? You would see a lot of parallels because, again, it's all about the chain. But let's get to see transportation and distribution. We clearly know if there was an important aspect of transportation and distribution to get the raw material into your facility, it's equally important for you to ship your product out to the market, and that's the transportation here. Processing of sold products. I asked a question about this. Now, there's a key difference between these two that we need to be aware of. What we're talking about here is that you may produce a material that is being used as an input by another industry. Now, that particular input, so let's take an example of steel. If this company here, sitting in here, is manufacturing steel, and then there's this, they're sending the steel out to another company, and that's the other company is using that steel to manufacture, I don't know, kitchenware, right? If they're doing it for kitchenware, that manufacturing process of kitchenware is what also deals with, is also causing emissions. So you've got to account for that aspect. So the processing of sold products that came from elsewhere and they have entered into another company's operations is the responsibility, still becomes the responsibility of this company to report if they were to report on scope 3.
So it's basically like B2B goods when you're manufacturing a good.
Perfect. That's a good parallel to draw. Yes, it's basically like B2B goods. You got to be aware of what's happening with in the other business entities operations your product, or they use your product. Right?
Yeah.
Then use of sold products is typically the end use of the product, typically B2C, it's reaching the consumer, whether it's gone to the route of a B2C or a B2B2C, whichever way it would have gone through, it's reached an end consumer. What's happening with that product during its use and at the end of its use as well. In fact, no, end of use is here, but use of the sold product. So if I am using a phone that is let's say from a manufacturer A versus my friend who's using a phone from manufacturer B, my phone requires me to charge my battery every 6 hours. The other person's phone doesn't discharge itself for 2 days. So during the use, I am actually causing more footprint because I'm charging my phone every 6 hours, which means I'm consuming that much more electricity during the use. So it's important that when you design your product, you kind of are conscious of the use aspect as well. There's a concept of design for life and design for the dump. I don't know if this is again something you may have heard of from people around you, but there's a lot of talk about. Sorry?
Design for recyclability.
Recyclability is another way to look at it, but design for dump versus design for life. The funda there is that the concept there is that when you design something for dump, you're probably almost looking at it as a single use kind of a life cycle, right? You're not really by philosophy, you're not developing products that can be repaired and still used. In fact, I think in the UK or in the European region, there's a right to repair as a fundamental right that's come out there. Maybe somebody can fill me up on this, but there is that right to repair that's coming to prominence, right?
Hey, I just had a question, Anvesh. Is it Is it possible to run through this scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 using a particular company or an industry, you know? So
I just said we will get there. We will do that with an industry, but not me. I'll get you to do it and we'll discuss this. I'll tell you how I've thought through that. Yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
Awesome. Thanks.
We'll get there. Sorry, I think somebody is not on mute. You may have to go on mute. Pratiksha, maybe you can see if you can mute the people. But yeah, I'll move on. Then there's the end of life treatment that is there, which is about what happens when you throw your device that you've been using in the bin. Is it really ending up there, or there is something that is like a take back policy, an EPR, an extended producer responsibility, that makes sure that the end of life treatment of sold products is done properly. But at the point with this particular label in here is that it's still required for companies to report on this aspect when they say scope 3 emissions. You cannot not be aware of what's typically happening with your products. You may, of course, have a few thumb rules, a few assumptions based on which you will say you can bring those numbers out, but you have to still consider that in the equation. Leased assets is about assets that are being leased out by you. So there could be assets that you own and you are leasing it out to other parties. Now this is different from that leased assets there. Here is a case where you lease out assets, and that's the emission footprint that's associated with those assets that you leased out to someone else. Franchises, like the name says, if you have too many dealers, it's a strong dealer network driven operations, a lot of franchises in the whole chain, then the footprint for their operations, their own shops, is still something that you own up as part of your scope 3. And then finally come the investments, which is to kind of mention the fact that everything that we spoke about here requires money. And where is that money coming from? Where is that money coming from, and where is it going? What sort of projects are you supporting with the money that you have access to in terms of green economy versus brown economy, or for that matter, gray economy? So what's happening with the investments? And this typically is what is associated with financial companies. So for a financial company, which is a banking or lending institution, you have access to capital. And what's happening when you are giving out that capital, and what sort of projects is it ending up in, is what is covered under investments.
Sir, I have a question.
Sure.
Sir, if a company is manufacturing B2B goods, does dealers come under the franchisee heading?
They should. According to me, yes, they should. They could come here, but I think we need to really see if there is a way to kind of see if they also can possibly fit in here. It's a case-to-case basis, but they could fit in one of these two places.
But they are separate entities, even if they are big corporates.
So are these, right? So are these, right? Everything that you see in scope 3, and that's the tricky part of scope 3. Scope 3 deals with everything outside. And so the reason a lot of companies are comfortable doing scope 1 and scope 2, but they keep scope 3 for much later, is because then they have to deal with so many entities outside. How do you think we will get the footprint numbers for these? Only if your partners on the left and the right are equally okay with disclosing or giving you the data points at least. There's no other way. Right? So that is why it is called scope 3.
Sorry, I have a question. What is the difference between the leased assets upstream and the leased assets downstream?
So leased assets upstream is what you have leased for your work, your own operations, right? I could give an example of a warehouse, right? If your raw material sits in a warehouse till you use it for your manufacturing operations, then that's a leased asset that you've taken from outside and you're using it to store raw material. This leased asset is leased assets that you own, typically a real estate kind of a setup, a commercial industrial real estate setup. You have a lot of assets and now you're saying you can use it. I'll give it to you. But the footprint associated with that leased asset will still be under the ownership of the reporting company.
Hi, I'm Veshi. Yep. This is Reed. I'm just thinking about where I bank as a company. Obviously, the banks themselves have different footprint. How on earth would you calculate I mean, for example, my bank account versus the, you know, billions and billions in a bank. How would I calculate that footprint of my bank?
So there is of course, as an individual, when you ask me that question, it's not, there's no way to answer that. But what I know banks do is that when they dole out loans, they put their money in different investment programs or investment schemes, let's say. They are aware of, they should rather be aware of where it's ending up, whether it's project finance, whether it's consumer finance, whether it's corporate finance, different aspects. They need to know where it's ending up. And because that regulation is important, and the reason we have in this session, we are trying to focus on financed emissions is just because of that. The point is, if you look at this financial industry, the banking industry, they are like the ones who are holding the steering wheel for this entire picture. And why do I say that? Because they have the money which is being directed towards different companies, private sector and projects. And then if they were to get their heart in the right place, they will probably go for a lot more greener investments. Of course, that's to an extent wishful thinking. But more importantly, a lot of these regulations, when I spoke about all of these things happening here, Singapore as an example, their primary focus has been on the financial institutions and how they are directing their finances towards greener projects than the other ones, right? Now, that's what's happening at an institutional level. But I think to answer your question, right, if you were to ask me, how do I tell you what's your footprint for your account that you hold with a certain bank? I think it's a tough nut to crack. Very, very, very vaguely possible, but not necessarily precise.
But if I'm Procter and Gamble, does that make it any easier?
It does, right? I mean, in the sense that for Procter and Gamble, you would know when you're taking a loan, you're kind of bringing in your cash flows from outside. You should be clear about where you're going to put it, and that is exactly also another scenario where you may say to the bank that you're going to put it in a sort of green project, and if it unfortunately ends up in a what I would have called a brown project, which is essentially means something that's got more footprint, I am causing what is called greenwashing. There was this question, a true or false question. What's greenwashing? It's not about cleaning the environment by any means. It's about hoodwinking. It's about misleading, right? So yeah, I would say the answer to whether it'll be easier for Procter & Gamble, answer is yes. The point is how much is the bank kind of making sure that they gather that data about where you're putting the money eventually, and how are they making sure that it's actually happening that way? So I would say that's where things lie.
Thank you.
Yep. So quickly, sorry, go on.
Hi, I have a question. Like I'm running a company, and my scope 1, my scope 3 emission.
Yeah.
Someone's scope 1 emission. Maybe possible.
Yep. Perfect.
So both
yes.
we are reporting while carbon footprinting while we are reporting. So as a whole, we are reporting more than we have generated the GHG. So how does it make sense?
Yeah, so that leads to a tricky situation, which is called double counting, right? What you said just now about the fact that the scope 3 emission that is in this picture for this reporting company, what is scope 3 is actually the scope 1 of the company for the other company. So it is true. But the reason scope 3 emissions are a lot more important is because as things stand today, a lot of this work on identifying scope or identifying carbon footprint and cutting it down has been voluntary till this point. And because it's voluntary, a lot of these reporting companies have been the ones that are larger in size. Now, when they are reporting, they have the resources to do all of the requirements under it. But when you go to a small SME and ask them to do the same exercise, they'll struggle. So that is why what is being asked for is that you, Mr. Large Company, you also tell me your scope 3. So tomorrow there could be a scenario where your supply chain also starts disclosing. And when that happens, we will account for double counting if at all it is a matter of concern at that point. But today where we are, I think that concern is much lower than the reason to at least account for what I called 70% of the pie, the scope 3.
Okay, sir.
All right. So guys, I think what we'll do quickly, like a couple of you have already asked for, let's get into what I'm going to call the breakout room exercise. The exercise is simple. I want you guys to, all of you all to scratch your heads on this. I've mentioned a bunch of different things on this picture. I'm hoping this picture is handy. And even if it's not, a quick Google search will give you the same picture, not something that's very different. Now, what I want you to do is step into the shoes of a certain type of a company. So here's what it is. I've got breakout group, 3 breakout groups that I'm asking for. 1 second, I'm not able to see. So let me, yeah. So 3 breakout groups. One is a residential buildings company. I want you to think of what could be the carbon footprint for a residential buildings company. What I want you to do is just write the labels, like indirect emissions, what could it be for a residential buildings company? Don't have to give me numbers, nothing. Whatever comes to your mind in terms of direct emissions. Direct emissions is scope 1, remember. Indirect emissions is scope 2 and 3. Whatever you believe is relevant for this kind of a company, just pen this down. You can create your own tables at your end. But the point is to list down direct emissions and indirect emissions for this company, for group 1. Group 2, I would want you to step into the shoes of an IT services company, typical Microsofts and Accentures of the world is what I'm referring to. Step into those fellows' shoes and see what sort of emissions are you going to be looking at if you were to be an IT services company, and including 1, 2, and 3, scope 1, scope 2, and 3, right? And then the third group gets to do this for a bank, right? So I think just by the name of the industry, we should be familiar with what each of those guys do. If you're not, ask me and I'm happy to answer, but let's give it a stab. Yeah. Any questions before we go into breakout rooms? I'm sure Ria or Pratiksha would have created the breakout rooms by now.
Yes,
Yeah.
the rooms are ready.
Right. Okay, cool. So why don't we get them into the rooms? We'll also have 3 people supporting, helping you with guidance. We've got a bunch of people who will be there in your rooms if you needed guidance, but I'm sure it's a brainstorming exercise and each of you all have your own ways to kind of explore this by yourself. So please go ahead and do it in the rooms. So Pratiksha, Ria, you could let us know when you're ready and we could get into the rooms.
All right, we've set the timer for 10 minutes for these rooms.
Yeah.
So I'm opening the rooms now.
Is this the room for the IT services company?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, guys, I think it's a good chance to get started. Somebody has to kick this off. It's 10 minutes and the ticker is on. Off mute, go off mute quickly.
Just talk.
I think the commuting of the employees would come in scope 2 and scope 3. Indirect emissions.
I think the company and facilities for servers for an IT company can come under scope 1 if they own their own servers, but can also come under scope 2 if they outsource it. So it could be either or. I think we can put it in both.
For the company direct, I was thinking any heating, waste and water, electricity.
If
Also
they're
the use
using
of
any
the
diesel
internet
generators.
Also the
Hello?
use of internet, yeah.
If they are using any diesel generator, so use diesel will become under the direct scope.
The main, according to me, a direct emission would be use of the internet and the electricity, which is from own, so it would come under direct emission.
Yeah, cooling is a big issue for IT companies because of the equipment room.
That's under indirect, right? Because they have to buy it from someone that they're purchasing this.
Indirect could be things like a lot of them have, I think internet was mentioned already, but often some of these companies use external servers. They use, you know, kind of other hosted services, which I guess would be indirect, right?
So server facilities could be outsourced and they could
Yeah,
be,
that's right. Yeah.
so that would come under indirect because they're purchasing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those
Voice generation.
indirect scope 3.
Also, there's a lot of use, obviously, of third-party software from these companies, and I'm assuming that potentially software usage might be one of the really higher indirect because they use software for so many companies.
Yes.
But how does software impact carbon emissions?
Because of the emissions of those companies, the software that they're using. It's indirect. If you're
Also,
using
the
Oracle.
land of use or assets, I think it will come under leased assets. They use the office space that they're using. So it will come
Yeah.
under assets and it will come under indirect emissions.
Yeah. I
But if
think
they
someone
own
mentioned.
But if they own the buildings, that would come under direct facilities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah.
IT companies do mostly, I work for one, a lot of travel and a lot of hotels.
So business travel would come under indirect.
That would be direct. Is it direct?
What actually come under scope 1 for IT companies?
So scope 1 is
basically
directly
your
something.
own.
Yeah, they own.
From your
yeah.
home, like basically by you, what you are doing from your end, if there is something.
No, but for any IT companies, they are not producing any goods. So that means they are not directly burning any coal or any fuel. So then
But in
what would
case
become?
they own their own property or anything, then it comes under direct.
Yeah.
So if they
Property
have
means
the
the
office of your
infrastructure,
own building.
means
Yes,
the office
yes.
building.
Yes.
But office, most of the cases, the IT companies hire the offices on rent basis. Then that would
If they
be.
do own, suppose if Google has an office, has bought a building, then it would be under direct. But if they have leased a building, then it would be indirect. So anything they have purchased.
Sorry, Anushree. Sorry, Anushree. I think I disagree with you on that point. Even if it's a
Yes.
own building, the electricity would be purchased. So
Correct.
that would
Yes,
be an
electricity would
indirect
be.
scope of emissions.
Indirect under scope 2.
But if they have diesel generators in the facilities, that would be backup generators where diesel is used, then that would come under scope 1.
Correct. That may come under, yes, that would be come under scope 1. But because they are not producing any goods, that's why I was thinking that
Yeah,
they are
yeah.
not
Because
emitting
if
actually.
they do have buildings that have servers, that generates a lot of heat and that generates a lot of carbon emissions. So it could be
No,
that
heat,
the
how they're
company-
generating heat means if they have building, then how they're generating heat.
a building generates.
Can we say data center as generating the heat?
Yeah, from
must be
servers.
on the
Data
cloud.
center are
Yeah.
generating the heat, but heat is not actually emission. Heat is the actually use of electricity they're purchasing from the grid, which is coming
Yeah,
under
but it's the
scope 2.
it's the cooling that's required for the heat in the equipment rooms.
Oh, that means they're purchasing electricity, no? Means for creating cooling or creating heating, they're purchasing electricity, and from there they're running their chillers. So that will come under the scope 2 indirect. So I was
Yeah.
actually thinking for the IT
But it
company,
might,
then what
but
would be
it
the
might
direct?
happen. Excuse me, but it might happen that they can use diesel generated at the leased infrastructure at.
Yes.
So
Yeah, but if they own the chillers, isn't that scope 1? If they own the
Yes.
chillers?
Yes, yes, it would be.
So
Yeah,
why-
if they own the if they own the chiller, but chiller is not operating through electricity, correct? Either it should
No, that's
operate through
fine.
electricity or it should operate through steam.
No, so there are a
for
couple of.
electricity, they're purchasing from.
Sorry, Somnath, there are a couple of bifurcations there. So chiller is a capital good. So capital good would come under scope 1 indirect. Sorry, scope 3 upstream indirect. Whereas the electricity required to run the chiller would be purchase electricity, and that would be scope 2 indirect.
Correct, correct. But I was
So
thinking
now
that what
only
would be
there's only
Scope
3
1.
minutes. So do we have anything for direct emissions? We have
Can
amongst
we
land
take
and
Yeah.
water can be used for both. And then we have heating, cooling that would also come in indirect. Then commuting comes in indirect.
Company
Then
vehicles would
purchase
be
of
direct.
IT softwares would come under indirect. What else
Can
comes
we
under?
can we take
Can we say
e-waste
the food?
generation under direct?
The under
E-waste
indirect,
generation?
most IT companies subcontract a lot of work. External service providers is actually quite high on an IT company's emission, I believe.
Can we say the food that we brought from outside inside the IT company and the fuel that are being used for cooking the food that can be considered as indirect emission?
Yeah, scope 3 indirect, I believe.
But it is not
The
generating the
LPG
CO2 as
and
such.
PNG or LPG or PNG.
Which fuel you are talking about?
I'm talking about the cooking stuff, the food
Is it
that we are
contributing to the
bringing.
GHG emissions?
Yeah,
That would be
for
individual, right?
using
I mean, will it be affected directly to the company?
It would
no,
be, I think, either
because
come
if
under waste generated,
if the vent if okay yeah
Yes,
continue.
waste generation we can take food waste as well as the. Can we take e-waste also under the direct?
I think
Is
e-waste
it an
would be
increase?
indirect because e-waste is after, it's generally in the downstream activity, right?
Yeah,
But
the
it can
processing, the
generate in the
recycling
company
processing
also
generated.
as well. The
So yeah,
company
it would be
Yeah, but
under,
the
it would be
recycle
under
processing
upstream
only
and
generate
downstream.
the CO2, which will consider it as an indirect emission. The recycling of e-waste that will be a indirect. Sorry.
I think
What
so. Most
I'm
of IT.
telling is that what I'm telling is that the food which are being cooked outside of the company, and suppose a vendor is tied up with IT company, like I'm working in IT company, and which we bring food from outside, and that are being the base kitchen are situated outside of the company, who are using the PNG and LPG to cook the food. So can that be considered as indirect emission?
That would
Yes,
be
I think that
indirect,
would be
I guess.
upstream activities.
actually fuel
Upstream
consumed
indirect.
for the
So
transportation of
basically,
food.
indirect emission.
I think fuel used for the transportation of food till the facility we can consider it as indirect.
Which group is this that's coming back? What did you do? Which case study was this?
No, Anveshi, I actually clicked on it and we got separated.
That's okay, but is this the breakout room 2, 1, 3? Which one is this?
I think the first one, First residential. one only. But
This,
we are second one, IT.
okay.
like
So,
we closed it now.
yeah, I understand. So there's breakout room 1, 2, and 3 also out here right now. All of you all are back. I think 1 and 2 is back. 3 is not yet. Right. Okay. For folks from breakout room 1, because I was in 2, I was in room 2 and I heard the conversation very, very interesting about how it went. In fact, most often than not, I think 90% of the time, you guys debated it right and concluded it right. Thanks for that. But breakout room 1, how did it go?
So it was when we have shortlisted good number of indirect scope 2 and scope 3 list of emissions. In case of direct one, we found 2 or 3 mainly. But in case of indirect emissions, we found scope 3.
Can you tell me direct? What did you find for direct?
Direct, we found if there is a chance of deforestation, then there's a direct emission harm. Then there are air, carbon emissions, and dust pollution during the construction of the residential building.
Correct.
Along with that, the resources associated with that. Maybe we are purchasing the cement and all the other raw materials. So again, we categorized under the scope 1.
Okay, but you said, you just said purchase, right? When you say purchase, it's of course.
Yeah, purchase comes under scope 3 upstream.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought. But I think of the three sectors, I believe now we may have all the people back here. Yeah, more or less, I guess everyone's here. Of the three sectors, the first one, which is the residential buildings one, definitely has a significant amount of categories or significant amount of topics under which scope 1 emissions can be covered. Of course, if you want to broadly bucket it, you'll say during construction. But during construction, there's so many different things that happen in that setup compared to an IT company, compared to a banking company. The real residential buildings company has a lot of scope 1 footprint. Do we all agree that? I know all of you all discussed one sector only, but now that you're back here, do we agree that you think scope 1 in residential buildings is significant?
Yes.
I heard scope, the breakout room 2, there was a lot of discussion about do we even have scope 1 for an IT company? What's scope 1 for an IT company, right? And I think you guys definitely hit the nail on it when you said if the building is owned by itself, and in the building if there is particularly some aspect of the operations in there. And one thing I think you did not touch upon is, of course, we talked of cooling and all, but cooling is part of the cooling is energy requirement, but the other part is when you have the emissions, the chlorofluorocarbons that come out of cooling, right? That's an important aspect of scope 1 emissions in a typical office setup, not just IT, but any office setup, including banks, right? The air conditioning equipment releases CFCs, and that could also be a cause of emissions, source of emissions. Right.
Then you have refrigerants that will come under scope.
The refrigerants, yes, of course, yes.
Right. Basically, then it is scope 3 emissions, isn't it? Like the AC.
Not really, right? In an IT company, you are installing air conditioning in your office, in your rooms, and that's what's causing the emissions.
So then it could be like if it's owned, then it could be scope 1, or else it would come under scope 2 or 3.
Scope 2. If you're procuring, you're purchasing cooling facilities from outside, yes.
So, but the air conditioner comes under capital goods.
Which one? Yeah, purchase goods is one thing, but purchase goods and the footprint associated with the good during your use, that's another. Right? But during the purchase, you are accounting for what went into manufacturing that equipment, right? When you purchase a good, you're talking of the footprint that went into making it. But during the use of it in your manufacturing setup or in your operation setup, that's a different parameter.
So if the AC is a 5-star rating AC,
yep.
So you have a lower carbon footprint, you say, and if it's a lower star AC, then you say it's a higher carbon footprint.
There is definitely a strong case for that because low 5-star rated equipment consume less electricity.
Yeah, so it's beneficial for us, right, in scope 1 emission.
Yes, it is. You're right.
Or scope 2 emission because of the electricity.
Yes, because of it's scope 2 actually, because you're consuming less
and if it is releasing less amount of GHG, that is the fluoro cooling effluent, then that comes under scope 1.
That's scope 1. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So okay. I think there's going to be, of course, a lot more questions like these that will pop up as you explore industry by industry. Not every industry is the same. When somebody spoke of SASB, under SASB there are 77 industries, and each industry has a picture of its own in terms of where the footprint lies. So you have to see how you understand each industry and evolve this kind of an understanding. If you were to be looking at careers doing this job or this kind of work, then I think you need to be aware that everything is industry specific. That's important. That's the message there.
I have doubt here.
So wait a minute before we look for doubts. So I have another 15 minutes of course content to be covered. I'm happy to take questions, but are we happy to extend by another 15 minutes? If we are okay, we'll go ahead.
Yes, please.
Yeah, please. And have we touched upon the group 3, the bank one also?
No, we haven't, but that's why I'm trying to take a pause and let you guys know that the coverage of the content I need 15 minutes. I can take questions for another 5 minutes, but which would mean we'll only wrap up at 8:45 p.m.
Definitely we can extend, but can we just discuss what we did the exercise of all the 3 groups? Will that also be included?
I would rather say questions would be a better way, because if we discuss, I'm sure you'll need Each of the groups will need 10 minutes each.
Yeah, I
Right?
think that's better. Let's complete the content, then we can go for Q&A. I think that will be better.
The content for me is more important than the
And
discussion.
sir, we can give the example of Microsoft, HDFC Bank, and the residential industry. They will explore the sustainability report. And if they have any question, they will write to me and I'll send it to you. But
That's equally okay. That's equally okay.
That's
so
a
let's
good
cover
point.
the for the content now, because that is really important.
Right. So guys, I know there are queries. We're not ducking it. We're just saying we need to be considerate of the time that we have so that we keep moving as well. Bring your questions to the table. We'll have your answers also. Right. We can move to this slide. So we were looking at this picture not too long back. I'm sharing my slides. Can somebody quickly confirm? Visible?
Yes, it is.
Visible.
Visible.
Wonderful. Okay. So we back to the same picture that we were on a few minutes back, and I've got a circle in here, and that's because we're going to now talk about financed emissions. And in financed emissions, of course, scope 3 indirect. I did mention when we were talking about this that category of scope 3 comes out in prominence for financial institutions a lot more. So when I talk of financed emissions, I'm talking about the fact that I am giving money. The money is ending up in some sort of a project, some sort of a investment somewhere. And if that project, that investment eventually is causing some footprint because of the way it's structured, then I need to be aware or need to be conscious about it as the lending institution, which is the bank or any sort of a lending institution for that matter, right? So that's why that's going to be the focus of the next couple of slides. Now, when I say financed emissions, when I say in this context of climate finance, what do you think we are financing, or what sort of coverage are we talking about? I'm going to put out 3 words on the screen. If any of you can take a stab and tell me what those 3 words are telling you. I'm talking of types of climate finance, and I've got 3 things there. What am I talking about?
Mitigation is something which we
Finance is where
to stop something.
Okay, stop something is mitigation.
Investments in the project that aim towards minimizing the climate change impact.
That is which one?
Mitigation.
Okay, fair enough.
And
Moving on. Adaptation.
Adaptation
Something
is
to live with it. Like we install AC, so we are living with the increased temperature. That is trying to adapt with self.
I want you to connect with climate finance. Okay.
When we
Keep
talk
connecting
about
this
climate finance project investments related to the projects that help the community to adapt to the changes. Like if I
Fair
talk
enough.
about
let's move further.
Investments that are made towards controlling the losses and the damage which are done. If I give you an example, like Amazon rainforest fire. So there are a lot of investments around afforestation in the Amazon forest.
Yeah. Okay.
Or maybe because people lost lives because of some cyclone or tsunami.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So cutting the story short, if you guys have kind of taken note of the kind of discussions that happen when these countries come together for the COP conferences, this is the kind of things that get debated. There's no convergence on this one yet in terms of where climate finance is required. A lot of the developed world is intending to put a lot of their climate finance into mitigation and in fact significant amount of it to adaptation and mitigation, right? But then there's this other side of the world which is saying we are bearing the brunt of climate change, so we need finance to address this. We see floods happening day in day out where we stay, so can you put finance towards this? So exactly about whether you're trying to foresee the damage and address it upfront before the damage hits you, which is mitigation. That's the kind of financing that we're talking about. Then the adaptation is the damage has happened, it's hit you, or rather it's about to hit you, let's say. And when it's hit you, how are you adapting to those situations? How are you making sure you're able to cope with it? You're able to cope with it, right? You're trying to make sure that you're not bearing a bigger shock because of that damage or because of that emergency. But then post-event, the loss that happens, somebody said loss of lives. Yes, that's exactly what this is about. How do you address those situations? Because those need money as well. How do you get for the society, the people out there to recoup and get back to the normal lives. So when you talk
Sir,
of
I
climate
have a
finance,
question where the insurances and all for residential projects, do they come into mitigation or loss and damages?
depends on what policy we're talking about, what kind of coverage we're talking about, right? So I don't think there's a straightforward answer. In fact, I think insurance schemes are there for all three categories. Today, insurance companies are looking at all of these three as possible opportunities for them to pitch in. So depending on how it's structured, it could fall under each of them.
Thank you.
So taking the example of Bangalore floods, would mitigation mean better urban planning, and would adaptation
Absolutely.
mean better
So if there's a project,
better, disaster management?
yeah, if there's a project to build stormwater drains today for a city in anticipation that there could be floods tomorrow, it's mitigation.
Okay.
Right.
And
So that's
adaptation
what
would be like how you manage that disaster when it happens, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. How are you adapting to that situation, which unfortunately is hitting you? And post-event, how are you addressing the whole idea of getting things back to normal?
To do relief measures come.
Absolutely. They come here, right? So the point being, climate finance can end up in any of these three buckets, and climate finance, or for that matter, financing in general, is happening through financial institutions, banking sector. That's what we're talking about. And of course, I would say BFSI, including the insurance, banking, financial sector, and insurance companies, right? All of them. But if that is what it is, right, then we need to be aware that there are ways to structure these dole outs or the lending instruments, and typically financial assets or financial classes that are relevant from a climate action perspective. This is a snapshot that I've pulled out from a framework called PCAF. I think it's a group of financial institutions that have come together and created that, and they have come out with this kind of a representation. So what is being represented here is the fact that when we talk of financing for the private sector, we're talking of corporate finance, we're talking of project finance, and we're talking of also at some point consumer finance. So what do we mean by each of them? Equity and corporate bonds, I think it's fairly straightforward in terms of where you are putting your money for some sort of an equity associated against it. So if you are a banking institution that is giving out money to kind of a private sector entity, and in return you're saying, I'll probably hold on to some sort of an equity in your organization. So that's the kind of investment that they do. They also do, of course, what is called the business loans. Very simple and straightforward. They're giving money on a certain interest rate for you to run your operations, do your projects, do your work, and of course they expect you to pay it back with the interest component included in there. Then there's the project finance. So it could be about financing projects in this case, because we're talking still about climate action, project finance that are for green projects like the picture represents. What if you wanted to set up a renewable energy project, a solar energy plant? That's the kind of project that finance that we're talking about. Because of the fact that there's a lot of footprint associated with buildings, even your commercial real estate comes into play here. You want to be aware of how you're dealing with commercial real estate and what sort of buildings are you supporting? Are you lending your money towards? There's a lot of real estate that is coming out for green buildings, right? There's a lot of LEED certified buildings. There's a lot of, in India, there's something called GRIHA certified buildings, essentially green buildings at the end of the day. Now, if you're supporting those kind of commercial real estate, it's of course positioning your money alongside the green economy. Now that's the other instrument. Then there's the mortgages, which could be, again, like I said, corporate mortgages, could be consumer mortgages, but at the end of the day, these are loans that are typically for consumers to kind of get across their investments, their homes for themselves. So this is when you're buying homes for yourselves. Then there's the motor vehicles. Again, the picture and the name says it all. It's all about how you could facilitate automobile purchases and things of that nature. Now, why did these asset classes come into picture? Because these have been identified to have the most significant footprint out there. Now, we need to tie this picture with the previous one. and see how we relate. So when somebody said, if there was a flood situation and if there was money being set aside in anticipation of another reoccurrence of that scenario, and they say they want to construct the whole rainwater management system or stormwater drain system, then that's a project finance that is happening towards that. So similarly, you'll have to always consider where your investments are going and see if it's leading to something that's around mitigation, something that's around adaptation, or under the loss and damage category. Is this picture kind of giving you a sense of the different asset classes out there?
Yes, and totally the 6, or in addition to it, there's only the hand-picked one, or totally?
So these are the, let me call it the cream in terms of the footprint, high footprint classes. There's more, of course. There's of course got to be more.
Sure.
Yeah. So with that said, I think that's the context of financed emissions and climate finance that I thought we should have. Be aware when you're talking to a banking company, you typically don't stop it at the usual footprint areas of scope 1, 2, 3. In scope 3, you would go a far more level of detail into the investment angle. And that is crucial because, like I said at some point, it's the steering wheel that drives the vehicle, left or right, which way it goes. And in fact, the whole private sector is driven by these kind of lending instruments. So you got to be very cautious and careful about how you're dealing with a banking institution if you were to be working to address their footprint, right? Okay, I'm going to jump topics quickly and we're going into what is called opportunities. I know again for a fact that last session, there was some amount of coverage on risks as well. Now, why we talking of risks and opportunities in the same breath is because out there in the world, there's changes happening. Now that change that's happening, any change for that matter, that's happening out there is typically going to impact businesses. Whether it's going to impact positively or negatively is another question. Just as an example, pandemic. When the pandemic happened, lockdowns happened, businesses had to come down. So it's definitely hit them on their bottom line. So they didn't really have a good year to show, a lot of businesses for that matter. So a sort of a scenario like a pandemic is a risk for a lot of companies. Let's take an example of a manufacturing setup where people couldn't even visit the facility where the manufacturing happened. So if I were to look at the pandemic, and I'm taking a very relatable example, it's not a directly climate related example, although I would draw a dotted line there, but I'm taking a relatable example, pandemic risk for a manufacturing setup. But the same pandemic is an opportunity for the vaccine folks, the pharma guys, right? So you've got to be aware of the changes that could happen there, are happening there, and anticipate that and be aware of how you would want to categorize those changes. You identify, you assess, and you manage. The same thing happens with the opportunities as well. The point being that either a risk or an opportunity is external in nature in terms of what's happening out there. Got to be aware. Climate risks is a concept that's being spoken about a lot. A lot of companies are doing their ESG or being asked to do their ESG by investors, by whoever, only because climate risks is what they're bothered about. What if it affects your company? What if you're not able to give me the profit number that you thought you would? All of those questions. And so it's a reason for them to look at the external changes that could happen, changes along different lines, political, economic, social, geopolitical for that matter, different things, even the pandemic sort of changes, right? Everything, you got to look at them and then assess go through this cycle. And in that sense, once you do that, you also would want to draw your inference of how near term, medium term, or long term could it be for a risk to hit you, or for that matter, for an opportunity to benefit you, right? So near term, medium term, long term is about saying, I'll take a 1 to 2 year horizon, call it near term. A 3 to 5 year horizon, call it medium term. Anything beyond 5, long term. So if that is the time horizon, do I think this risk, which let's say as a risk, we're talking about floods. Do I see floods hitting me again in a couple of years because I've been hit this year? Possibly, yes. And so it's a near-term risk for you. But then at the same time, there could be risks that are long-term. The whole global warming scenario, could it affect my business as the temperature rise goes beyond 1.5? Long-term, but still relevant. You got to consider. At the same time, with opportunities. When do I benefit? Do I see a benefit coming out of an opportunity in the near horizon, or is the horizon much longer? Right? Likelihood of occurrence. Do we really see that happening as much as frequently as regularly as it could possibly? What is the likelihood, right? The more the likelihood of a risk, the more you need to pay attention, very obviously. If it's something that happens, let us say once in 5 years, or the frequency is not so much, you'd probably give it a little bit of a backseat while you address the important ones. So the likelihood of occurrence of a certain change out there, which could be resulting in a risk or an opportunity, is a factor to be considerate of. Potential impact. Yes, there could be risks. Yes, there could be changes. Yes, there could be opportunities. What does it mean for me eventually? Is there a high impact because of that? Do I have a medium impact? Does it impact me significantly lower? Same with benefit on the opportunities front, high, medium, and low. Where do I lie, right? You got to be, these are the parameters that you need to be considerate of before you decide which risks are you trying to address first. It's like what is typically done in your BCG matrix, the 4-quadrant matrix, right? You want to always address the ones that have a high likelihood of occurrence and a high impact, and potentially are also near-term in nature first before you get to the others. That's the idea with this section of the table. Now, in terms of examples, I think these labels are fairly self-explanatory, but I'll quickly touch upon a couple of them here. So there's this concept of physical risks and transition risks that was introduced in the last session. Physical risks is about what could happen to the physical environment around you and it could impact you. Acute physical, chronic physical. I'll give you specific examples to understand that better. Chronic, like the name says, is something that builds over a period of time. It's not impacting you today or just because it's happened. It'll build over a period of time. Simplest example, back to our school, soil erosion. Soil erosion doesn't happen overnight, right? Oceans acidification doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. The corals don't turn white overnight. It all takes time, but that's chronic physical. It's something that's happening out there, but it's over a period of time. Acute physical is an impact that happens pretty much at that very moment, in instantaneous floods, forest fires. Those are acute physical. When they happen, they impact you right away. That's acute physical. So those are the two aspects that are important. Then there's the transition risk. Transition risk is about if you are moving from a current way of operations to a newer way of operations because you're anticipating a lot of these climate risks hit you. Because of the transition from your current operations to the newer way of operations, there could be risks. Risks could be in the sense that you would lose your supplier base because suppliers are not ready to move with you. Risks could be in the sense of you not being able to cater to the demands of your consumers because you are in a transition mode. And in transition mode, typically your capacities and capabilities come down. So that's transition risk. So be aware of those aspects. The rest of them is more simpler to understand, at least by the word. I'm sure there's a level of detail that you may want to be aware of, but the rest of them are fairly straightforward. I'm happy to answer questions on the rest, but be aware of the transition risk and the physical risks because those are important concepts that come up more often in the conversations on climate risks. Then there's the opportunity side. Of course, again, these are examples. Efficiencies and products and services. What kind of products are you bringing to the market? How resilient are you? All of those are opportunities that you could consider for yourself. So happy to kind of touch upon any of them if you have questions, but otherwise this more or less marks the end of the session. I have something more to tell after this slide, but that's not me giving you any more. There's no monologue after this. Yeah, so I'm happy to kind of take a pause here.
Okay, so Anveshi, can we give them an exercise on what should we do?
Yeah, so the exercise is simple. I think there's an Excel sheet that will be shared with you. Should I bring it up on the screen? What do you think?
Yeah, please.
Is it a good idea? Yeah, shall I? Okay, so there we are. Let me know when you see an Excel. Not yet, I guess. Yeah, now we do, right? Okay, no. Yeah, so you'll receive an Excel like this. So there's a bunch of things in column A, and I would want you to look at these things and probably even go ahead and Google it up. I think you guys are already segregated into different groups, 5 members, 6 members each. Within your group, you can figure out how to distribute this list. It's about list of 19 or 20. Go ahead and with each of them, identify where do they fit in. I've just randomly marked yes, yes, yes. I don't think this is by any means an answer. In fact, I'll knock it off if you want me to. But important thing is to do the exact thing that I just knocked off. If you think changing customer behavior, and I'm just throwing on there, if you think changing customer behavior is a regulatory risk, then you mark it yes, right? But if you think it's not regulatory, but it's a market risk, you mark it yes here. Or if you think it's both, leave a yes on both of them. That's fine. I want you to fill this matrix with a yes, wherever you believe it maps to, right? That's one part of the exercise. Then there's part 2, and I think you can figure out for yourselves if you want to do both risks and opportunities or one of them. Your call. I would rather want you to do both, but take your call. And in this case, I would want you to go ahead and look at the opportunity space and look at how you will categorize these ones again on the same lines. If you ever feel lost, Google is your best help in terms of getting yourself a sense of what these mean, right? And if it helps you, I'll give you one more clue. This is coming from the CDP reporting template, right? You could always go back to the CDP reporting template, and CDP's website has a template for reporting. They also have guidance that they publish for each of these. So you can always go back to this list from there and see if it helps you. But Google is your best bet according to me.
Okay,
Is
thank
that
you.
requirement clear?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll share a TCFD's template as well so that they will get to know what exactly and we need from them. What is the regulation risk? What is the legal risk? So tomorrow I'm going to have a session on framework so that they will get to know more about this. I don't want you to do this today. We'll do this tomorrow together. And what do you think? What time would be better for tomorrow's session? Have you understood Anveshi's lecture?
Indeed, it is good, really good, and thank you. Very insightful.
Okay, so tomorrow 5 to 7, I want your time because I'm gonna tell you about 4 frameworks: GRI, TCFD, CDP, and SASP. And this is my voice right now, so don't think I'm a different person. Okay, great. So
you're saying tomorrow 7 confirmed, correct?
7 to 8, yeah, we can do that.
Okay,
but
perfect.
yeah, 7 to 8 works. Okay, thank you everybody. We'll just end this session, and thank you so much, Anveshi sir. You made a lot of complex point really simple. Even I learned a lot from the second slide, which took a lot of time. Actually, that was not decided, but Anveshi sir really put his effort and convey it to us. But thank you so much. And whatever doubts you guys have, we will share a Google form, okay, and Excel sheet. Whatever doubts you have, just put it over there. We'll talk to Anveshi sir and we'll get back to you, okay? We'll share the answer sheet to you.
Thank you, Avnish sir. Thank you so much. It was a fantastic session. I just have one doubt that last session's case study, when is it supposed to be completed by? Like
No, nothing like compulsion over here. I'll tell you about all the case study. I'll write it down somewhere, okay? Don't worry.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Hello, can you please share the links of our in Slack?
Sorry?
Please share the links which you have put in Zoom. Please share in Slack.
Everything is on Slack. You can see everything is on Slack. Everything is on a drive. We are not communicating on
Some link like PRI.
Yes, we'll share a document. We'll also share it also.
Okay, great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anveshi. And team, bye. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.